Hello, everybody. My name is Troy Roach. I'm a citizen scientist studying low-dose nicotine patches. And today I'm here talking with Tom Bunker. He is also a researcher in the field of long COVID and MECFS and these chronic post-viral diseases, but he studies fasting and autophagy as well. So, Tom, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm glad we're having this conversation and hopefully goes well enough. We have a series of these. Yeah, I'm a long COVID patient first and foremost, since 2020. I was fortunate to have a recover from my first case, but then and almost recover from my second journey. Yeah, I'm stuck in the long COVID chronic illness bucket like millions of others. And anyway, during my early in my thing, I noticed some things that I stumbled upon some things that seemed to help my encourage my recovery with diet and with short fasts. And I, like Troy, I started a Facebook group and started collecting data from patients that were trying diet and fasting as an intervention. And I got preliminary data and I ended up running an IRB approved clinical trial with an academic partner. And so anyway, I've just been doing everything I can to learn more about long COVID and figure out, ways to treat long.
Okay. So you said before that you're an independent patient researcher. So I often say that I'm a citizen scientist, but maybe I should switch it to independent patient researcher.
I mean, citizen science works too. I mean, I independent patient researcher was my label on a fasting clinical trial that we published, and independent just means I'm unaffiliated. Although I wish I were affiliated, employed by a university or medical research center. I wouldn't object to
Okay. So just in case there are any universities or research groups out there listening,
that.
you have a great candidate here. All right. Well, in my nicotine research, of course, I've seen results that about three-quarters of the people respond well. In my research so far, the data is only retrospective surveys, right? Where in your case, you've done longitudinal, prospective studies of patients and collected their data. In general, what percentage respond to the fasting?
Yeah. I mean, I basically I was at where you are now in terms of collecting data and trials. You're about where I was 4 years ago, roughly. And I had preliminary data from patient surveys. I was tracking people over time. I was seeing that people were real variable in how they responded, but some people responded a lot. And then we did that more structured, more rigorous trial. What percent improved? Well, I mean, out of 60 people, only two got worse. Everyone
Mhm.
else stayed the same or got better. But really, what's significant improvement? Because there's some noise and some bounds in the data. And I'd say, if people that improved like 25% or more, looking at their whole long COVID symptom burden, we had three-quarters of the participants, see what I considered significant improvement.
Yeah, well, that's about similar to our data as well. That about
Yeah,
three-quarters improved, and the average improvement was about 20% improvement.
yeah. I think there's a lot of parallels. And what we saw was really striking. Like there were a couple people that told me in an exit interview at the end that they thought they were fully recovered, like they were resuming their normal life.
Mhm.
But I mean, I don't consider the fasting and diet as a cure. It's just that there was a wide variability in how well people responded. But in the top half of the responders, I think the average reduction in symptom burden was like 80%. It was pretty dramatic.
Yeah. The my experience a couple years ago, I had a diverticulitis, and then I was fasting for 9 days while taking two antibiotics for the diverticulitis, and then I did a kind of very slow going back to eating food, adding in one food at a time to see which ones affected me or not, taking advantage of the fact that I wasn't so hungry. And that whole process improved my baseline by about 20%. I went from like 40% to about 60% with
That's
it.
a pretty good jump from one fast.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of surprised. I'm impressed that you've done I've never fasted anywhere close to that long. My longest fast, I think, was 5 nights and 4 days. I've been all about the frequency of fasts and just doing short fasts. And
Mhm.
nobody knows, like, what's the best way to use fasting and diet to what's the most efficient way to treat long COVID symptoms? Just like nobody knows, at least from what I've seen being a member of the nicotine group, is nobody knows exactly what the best way to use the patches is to, improve their condition. And because I've seen a lot of different ways people use it. So in some ways, it's like, hey, we're both on to something, but like, how do we show the rest of the world that this works and how best do we use this, to
Yeah.
improve people's symptoms.
Yeah. So I think that in both of these interventions, the nicotine patches and fasting are improving the quality of life for a lot of people, but neither of them are like complete miracle cures on their own or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's far from being a miracle cure.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, in the trial, the very best responders, we had one gal that actually, this is pretty interesting because, like, I didn't know, like, what things might confound the trial. So, like, I had people stop all their supplements, and because I didn't. There's all these things that affect cellular stress and autophagy, and so I just tried. I wanted a clean slate. But, there was, one gal that was, smoking a half pack a day. So and she turned out and she started, like, really severe, and she turned out to be one of the very best responders. I mean, she ended up with, like, 2 or 3 symptoms at the mildest severity, and I couldn't believe it. And, she liked the trial so much, she got her husband to enroll and a couple other people, so have a cluster of people from, this one area in California just because this one gal had such a tremendous response. But I was amazed. I'm like, "Well, is it because she's a smoker? I thought smoking would be a bad thing." But since then, I've had a small number of anecdotal reports where a couple people have told me that, "Hey, the nicotine patches plus the periodic fast is a very good combination." It's I'm trained as a cell biologist and an immunologist, so I always trying to connect the dots, like, okay, nicotine affects this NRF antioxidant pathway, and it could be, and fasting induces autophagy and turns over all the rusty mitochondria and stuff. I'm like, I mean, those 2 pathways in the cell crosstalk, and there is interaction between those 2, but are they synergistic or not? I have no idea, but I would love to do a trial, where, to explore that and see if those 2 things work together or not.
Yeah, yeah, that would be very interesting to
But
see.
first, Troy, we gotta show that nicotine works and, in a trial where you enroll people and then follow them through.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll get one started soon. I've got a trial designed and just waiting to see if I can get IRB for it or not.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a challenge. So the whole thing is a challenge. I've had a crash course in clinical trials, and, oh my goodness, I've learned a lot.
Yeah. Well, you said that you have the PhD in biology, right? I consider all of this research for me to be kind of like a crash course PhD. By the time after doing this for like another couple of years, I'll consider myself to have done a
Yeah,
PhD.
yeah, yeah, I mean, all the patients are getting a crash course in long COVID and feel like they know more than their doctors, and, yeah,
Hmm.
unfortunately, that generally, that's true.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, it is. Yeah, but now there are more and more doctors actually prescribing the nicotine patch.
Really?
Yeah, I've at first in it was like really difficult to get patients to use it and to trust it, and they were afraid to speak about it to their doctors. And now more and more there are people coming into the group saying, "My doctor prescribed nicotine patch and said I should go to this group to get support." I'm just like, okay, great, yeah.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, because they, when they see something that's working in their patients, they're like, well, that worked for 3 patients. Well, I'll just try it on more patients and see what
Right.
happens. So, because there's no set treatment. Yeah. So for today, the focus, I was going to have the focus be on measures for studies in long COVID, taking our two studies as examples of, what type of measures we have used or that we were planning to use, compared to different guidelines. I guess I'll start off with in the first study, the measure that we had was the Bell score because it was the easiest score in order to get an objective measure of how patients were feeling. No score is perfect, but it was fairly easy for patients to say, oh, my daily abilities are at this level at general, at 20% or 30%. And they're
Right,
kind of,
right. That's a measure of like your daily functioning, right?
yeah, it's a functioning scale, a very basic functional scale. So like if they're at 20%, it's not a good thing. The higher if they're at 100%, then that means that they're perfectly healed. Whereas I'm now at about 90% because I can do quite a bit. I'm just not completely healed yet. So it was a good scale because we were able to see how patients report their change. At the 2023 long COVID conference, all the people were talking about the different biomarkers to use, and they said, well, we don't have any biomarker. Some researchers said, well, if you don't have a biomarker, we can't do any studies. And another researcher got up and said, look, we have patients. They can speak. They can be our biomarker. We can ask them, do you feel like shit? No. Okay. All right. So, I mean, it's not considered so scientific because you don't have it's not measured in your blood or whatever. But if somebody's bedbound and then all of a sudden they're, going out for long walks, then that's a measure in itself.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels between long COVID and the MECFS, which has kind of been mostly ignored by the medical researchers for decades. And they both have large clusters of symptoms that don't show up on, standard laboratory tests, definitive biomarkers, although if you look at the blood and see at the proteins, you can see a whole bunch of things are different. It takes time to, develop these diagnostic biomarkers. But they're both challenging because it's a big constellation of symptoms that cross multiple organ symptoms, and doctors weren't trained on these conditions, when they were in medical school. And so it is challenging, but I mean, it's frustrating for the researchers that want definitive, objective markers that are well established and validated. But if you're willing to listen to patients and ask them about their symptoms and the frequency of their symptoms, and the severity of their symptoms, it's actually very easy and very common sense to track, like overall symptom burden over time.
Yeah. So, a paper that you shared that is from 2024, from Julia Moore-Vogel, Beth Pollock, Respire, Lisa McCornell, Neil Jowden, Megan Fitzgerald, Hannah Davis, and Alyssa K. Cohen, is called Designing and Optimizing Clinical Trials for Long COVID. And I
Yeah.
went through and highlighted some of the main points on the measures that they
Okay, and just to put
suggest.
that in context,
Yeah.
Hannah Davis et al. That was like, the pioneer in the long COVID space with I think in 2021, early 2021, they came out with this landmark paper, characterizing long COVID in an international cohort. And they were the one that did, surveys of over 1,000 patients and said, look there's over 200 symptoms associated with long COVID. And so that was really impressive,
Yeah.
as far as the patient-led research effort. And Julia Mogovor is at the Scripps Institute, and she's co-PI with Eric Topol, who's he's got millions and millions of dollars in NIH funding. He's like a leading medical researcher, and they're currently running the clinical trial to look at, I think, tirzepatide, the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Anyway, I just wanted to call them out. They're both part of the patient-led research collaborative, which is, have done a lot of things to help move the patient perspective forward in long COVID.
Yeah. And also just anecdotally, Hannah Davis uses the nicotine patches, and
Oh, really?
she has found benefit from the nicotine patch.
So one other aside thing, but I was at the NIH Recover conference this last fall, and some of the patients went out for dinner with Nancy Klimas, the longtime famous MECFS researcher who joined us outside at this table. And we were talking with her, and I was telling her, well, one of the most popular, self-treatments currently in the patient community are nicotine patches. Oh my God, she had a reaction. She was like, what? Nicotine? Nicotine is evil. Like, how in the world could that help anyone? Her reaction was over the top. And then about three people at the table, long COVID patients kind of got sheepish look on their face and said, well, yeah, actually, I'm using that right now. It was very entertaining.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, the reactions are so extreme just because there's a lot of misinformation and people are correlating smoking with low dose patches, which are
Yeah,
completely
I mean, well, it
different.
is unexpected, right? It'd be like someone saying, well, yeah, I'm drinking Jack Daniels and it's making me, it's fixing my long COVID symptom.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was like that alcohol is made from potatoes, so you can't eat potatoes because they're used to make alcohol, and the alcohol is evil. And it's like, what? Wait, two different things. Yeah. So I was just going to share the screen here, and then we can comment about the things that are highlighted.
Yeah,
So the first point on the endpoints, it says that we need to measure quality of life in the endpoints. And they suggest, for example, the fun cap scale. And there's two fun caps, like 54 and the 27. And I was planning on using the 27 because it was validated to be just as good as the 24, but half as long.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's excellent. Just in general, just to the way clinical trials are, is that with a few exceptions, generally, when you design a trial, you have to say, this is our primary measure, and we're going to be looking for a significant change in the primary measure or for it to cross some predefined threshold. It's like basically you got to walk into Vegas and put all your chips down on red 28 or whatever. And this is what our goal is. But then there are these secondary endpoints where you can
Mhm.
basically have as many secondary endpoints as you want. And I think that for long COVID, quality of life, measuring function like FunCap, I think those are great. But in my opinion, I would put those as a secondary measure and put something that directly assesses a broad range of symptoms
Mhm.
as the primary measure.
Okay. So you don't think that the changes in symptoms would correlate with
No, I
functionality?
think they would correlate. I'm gonna go to two extremes on a patient-reported outcome measure, just to kind of give you my perspective. One extreme, you could have a very simple patient-reported outcome measure. Are you fully recovered? Yes or no? Okay, and that's it. And that could be your primary outcome of the trial. And that would be very black and white, but it's still, subjective. Does the patient think they fully recover? I know some people with long COVID have said they're fully recovered, but then a year later they're active in my group and it's like, well, they weren't fully recovered. But basically, you don't capture very much information with a very simple primary outcome like that. And at the other end of the spectrum, like say you measured both the frequency and severity of all 200 symptoms, in the landmark, characterization of long COVID paper. Well, you'd get tons of information, but it'd be a nice continuous measure. You'd get all this information, but people with cognitive fatigue and brain fog are not going to do very well having to go through an encyclopedic measure. And so I think there's a happy median somewhere in between where you can capture quite a bit of information about the long COVID symptoms and severity without or down symptom specific measure is kind of what I favor.
Mhm.
And interestingly, the MECFS world, there's a professor in England. I forget her last name. I think it's Sarah Worley. But she has just come out with this times measure and is going through several rounds of validation to capture, the MECFS symptom burden. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is totally applicable. Everything in here is applicable to long COVID. And I think she had 60 different items that she covered. Although, some of them rolled up into like cognitive function or sleep or, but she basically had 60 different items in her Times patient reported outcome measure. And I think it's really good. I think you could turn around and use it in long COVID, no problem.
Hmm. Yeah. So for other like patient-reported measures, for the study, I was planning on using the Bell scale, which is just very easy cognitively for people, the patients to do, and the Fun Cup, and then also have patients record symptoms on a daily basis. But you said that the measure that you're using, you record some symptoms, but once a week.
Yeah, in our trial, we had 28 symptoms that we captured, like 0 to 4 severity, where zeros, they don't have it, and 4 was severe. So it was a real simple severity scale. And then we had like another 32 checkbox symptoms. And we just added up the severity scores and gave them 1 point each for each additional checkbox symptom. And that turned out to be a very sensitive, continuous measure. And we got statistically positive results. Interestingly, we also did just counting up the number of symptoms, and we got the exact same results. I mean, not surprisingly, the two were highly correlated. But tracking the severity, adds some noise because long haulers have flare ups. And when you have a flare up, the severity of your symptoms, well, the number of your symptoms might increase, but also the severity of your symptoms can increase dramatically. So basically, we're trying to measure something that's not, a continuous steady state condition. And that makes it a little bit more challenging.
Yeah. And you said that in your study, you told people to stop all of their supplements that they were taking in order so that they were tabula rasa going in, clean slate into the treatment. Whereas in my study design, I purposefully don't want people to stop the things they're doing because I think that it's more realistic to say, okay, try this as if, try the nicotine patch as if anybody was just going to try it. And most of the time, people don't just completely stop everything they're doing every time they trial a new thing. I mean, I wouldn't, if somebody said, no, I want to stop everything I'm doing and just do the nicotine patch, that would be fine as well.
Yeah, I mean that's reasonable, uh, and pragmatic. Just my perspective is, I years in the lab doing research, and I was it's ingrained in me. Like if you're doing an experiment, you try to change only one variable at a time, and I was trying to show definitively, if this worked or not, and therefore I wanted to get rid of as many potential confounders as possible. So,
Hmm.
so the people that did this, well, they were extremely motivated, right? But they were pretty much willing to do whatever. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate the people that participated.
Yeah. And also, I mean, maybe I think it's just it's like different stages of research or kind of a different mentality because there are some drugs that they research and then when they're doing it in a trial, they say, oh, this drug works because everything's so regimented and controlled. But then once that drug gets out into the real world, they find out that it's not really so effective or it's actually
Right.
even dangerous because the people are not using it
Right,
in the
right.
way
I
they
mean,
should be
for
using it.
example, the GLPs for diabetes and now for weight loss,
Mhm.
they cause nausea, and for some people, they cause severe nausea. They may have this miracle drug that works. Uh, if 25% of the people quit using it right away, well, really, it's not such a miracle.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe it's a miracle for the other 75%.
I mean, it's a miracle for some people, but and then it has a whole bunch of issues. And then what happens when you stop taking it? You gain
Mhm.
all that weight back.
Yeah.
It's like, and in fact, that's one thing I strongly recommend is that in our diet and fasting trial, we measured people all the way up to the end to like a week after their last fast, and we didn't have follow up. And that's one weakness of our trial. It's like people want to know, well, was the durability of their improvements? How were they a month later? How were they 6 months later? And unfortunately, I didn't put that in the initial design.
Yeah. Well, I mean, That's the problem with these things, is we can't do everything we want.
Well, I mean, you can do a lot, but you have to have it all carefully thought out in advance. You can't change it after the fact, or it's highly, highly frowned on.
Hmm. Yeah. And then the next point that I highlighted was the fact they were talking about using some objective measures for functionality, like the 2-day CPET or the Compass
So
31.
I'm really surprised they put in the 2-day CPET, because that, I mean, that's the cardiopulmonary exercise test where they go up to their maximum VO2 max. I
Hmm.
mean, that could put some people in severe PEM for days or
Hmm.
longer.
Yeah.
So, boy, I would not put that personally, I would not put that in one of my trials.
Yeah. I mean, for the nicotine test, I wouldn't put it in there because I think it's good enough. For example, we'll have people share their smart watch data, for example, and then we can look at how many steps they're taking, how often they crash, etc. We can get some good objective data without adding extra stress to the participants, I think. And then the next part is biomedical endpoints, which is the most, I think, most difficult since we don't have, universal biomarkers, but there are lots of signals that we can look at. If I do get enough money, I want to test, at least in some people, the inflammatory markers like TNF alpha, CRP, IL-1, IL-6, see if IL-10 goes up or not, etc. What type of biomarkers would you test if you had the funds?
So currently I am designing a clinical trial and trying with some partners, some academic partners, trying to get, NIH funding for like a real multi-million-dollar clinical trial. So I have a long list of things I want to measure,
Hmm.
but they're like research things, right? They're not standard medical things. They're like, I mean, I have a long list of them written down, but they're pretty much all things that have been shown to be different in people with long COVID, and statistically, some of them statistically different, but they're not yet, accepted biomarkers.
Hmm.
The thing I'm most interested in is trying to measure viral persistence. There have been some intriguing reports, one out of Spain and one out of California, where they detected fragments of the viral proteins. And this was like the N protein, the spike protein, and the California group purified exosomes, which are these tiny membrane bound bubbles that are given off by cells in some circumstances. And they found when the virus first infects cells, it makes this really, really long protein, and then it gets chopped up into a whole bunch of different viral proteins. And they detected a whole bunch of different fragments of this large polypeptide, viral polypeptide. I think it was, they detected viral fragments in like 14 of their 14 people that they had in this X study, that the small exercise study that they were doing.
Hmm. So what test, like if you could only choose one blood test, what do you think you would choose? What do you think would change with a fasting experiment?
Oh, if I only had to choose one,
One or two or a small amount. Here in the study, they mention cerebral blood flow measures and then natural killer cell, T cell functions, lactate levels, viral persistence, microclots, nerve damage,
yeah,
endothelial damage.
yeah. The main thing I want to measure is blood levels of this phosphorylated ATG13, and that's a protein that's involved in that the autophagy pathway. And there's a group, that Cimarron Research, and that group has, with University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, they've identified that if there's blocked autophagy in people with MECFS and long COVID, that
Hmm.
this aberrant phosphorylated ATG13 gets into the serum and may be stimulating general inflammation. So, like, from a research perspective, that's the one thing that I'm most interested in tracking. And I would like to see, specifically like to see, like, just before a fast, a short fast, and right after a short fast, is there a change in the levels of some of these things? The
Hmm.
second thing I'm really interested in are galectin-9 and artemin, because, and like, you can measure those using an ELISA kit in the sera or plasma,
I'm sorry,
because
you said galectin 9 and what else?
and artemin,
Hardiman.
Yeah, I can send you a paper, but there's a paper, I think, is by some University of Alberta researchers that are doing ME and some long COVID characterization now. I just like, I always look to see like the results, like, okay, the long COVID group, the control group, like, is there a big difference or is it just overlapping subtle difference? And these markers had a pretty big potential diagnostic.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about those markers. They're not ones that have come up on my radar.
Yeah, not surprising. There's a lot to choose from.
Yeah, I guess it depends. It depends because there's so many things to measure and different ways to measure. It depends how they
But
analyze it.
to measure those things, you have to collect blood. If it's you're doing an all remote study, you got to pay for shipping. You got to pay for remote blood draw, or you have to provide them with one of these tap devices so they can draw their own blood sample and mail it to you. And that all gets expensive really fast.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, but at least the new top devices, like the ones that are kind of like the CGM, where they put it on and you wait 10 minutes and it fills up a vial and they don't really notice anything and then they can just put it back in the box and send it back.
Yeah. That's what Julie Vogel-Moore's Locket trial is doing out of the Scripps Research Institute.
Hmm.
That's good way to go.
Yeah. Um, I was thinking of one thing that I saw, not related to long COVID, but related to exercise and people who are not adapted correctly to exercise. And it was the resting metabolic rate, which is basically the same thing as the 2-day CPET test, but the patient is just laying down. There's no exercise. They're just measuring the gases coming off of your breath for 15 minutes while you're lying down or sitting down. Have
Yeah,
you thought
and
about
there are other
something like that?
assays you can collect from a fresh blood sample. You can collect the PBMNs, the monocytes from the blood, and you can basically do this biochemical seahorse assay to look at the metabolism. Like, is it mainly burning sugar? Like, how healthy are the mitochondria? You can get some pretty good insights into the cellular metabolism if you can get fresh blood. So that's another thing that's on my wish list of things to do.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's about it from the measures, but there's another thing that they mentioned in the article, which I find interesting, is they said that different research groups should collaborate and combine research trials together, so that they're using the same measures and they're actually using the same control group. So you could have one control group serving as the control for 4 or 5 treatments. What do you
Yeah,
think
I
about
mean
that?
I mean, trials are not gonna do that, but there is this adaptive trial design or platform trial design, where one well-funded group can, using the same enrollment criteria, can, enroll a control group, and basically, if they're trying treatment A, B, C, and D, they can use control group E, the same control for other multiple treatment groups. So that's
Hmm.
one way to make more efficient use of patients.
Yeah.
And
So,
what we did was very rather different, rather unique. I mean, like 85% of clinical trials are these parallel arm trials, where people join and they get one treatment, they do one treatment for a period of time, and that's it. And then they can get compared to the treatment arm that just got the placebo. But with our fasting trial, we did a crossover design where the same people did the fasting treatment and just the mild intermittent fasting treatment. And it's like a old fashioned balance scale. You do 4 weeks of this, and then you have a washout period. Then you do 4 weeks of that, and you're
mhm,
using the same people. Everyone gets the same treatment. Have to do the intensive intermittent fasting, and then the other treatment, and the other half, do it in the opposite order. It's a it The people is like perfect controls, and you're directly comparing two different treatments. That's a really sensitive way to compare two different treatments.
yeah,
So
that's
that's what we did with the
right, yeah.
fasting, because there's no placebo pill for fasting. People know if they're fasting or not. So that's why we use that crossover design?
Part of my study design, depending on the money we get, is to have a crossover where people do placebo and the normal nicotine patch, and they can see how it's affecting them. And then also I have like the first 2 weeks they're doing the lymphatic drainage beforehand. So the lymphatic drainage in itself is a kind of treatment, and then they start the patch, whereas the control group just does the lymphatic drainage and see if there's, a difference. They're both doing the lymphatic drainage, but one of them's adding the nicotine patch.
Right, right, right. So you can have that kind of as a baseline to help people a little bit
Mhm.
underline the whole trial.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah, yeah.
also because the lymphatic drainage helps drain um, a lot of garbage that's been building up, and there are actually Herc's responses to the lymphatic drainage as well. So maybe if people can kind
Interesting.
of clear their system, the lymphatic system, before they start the nicotine patch, then maybe they would have fewer side effects to the nicotine patch when they start.
Well, potentially you could, if it's beneficial, potentially you could use that as, one treatment would be the lymphatic drainage, and the other would just be the nicotine patches with or without the lymphatic drainage, and compare that because you can see a statistical difference as long as like one treatment is mildly effective and the other is more effective. They often use this crossover design in trials where like they're introducing a generic version of an existing drug and they want to show that they're comparable or like there's no significant difference. Of course, we want to see, which treatment is better.
Yeah.
That's interesting, Troy.
Yeah. So it could be designed that we could design it. We could work together and add in a fasting group, and and in your trial you can add in a group that's doing the fasting and nicotine patch or something.
I got so many ideas. I could spend half the NIH budget.
Yeah. Yeah. I know how it is. My research design is like, okay, I'm going to do this and this and this. And if I have money, I'll do this.
He tried. If we have some time left, I just want to show you my latest symptom
Yeah.
survey that I'm kind of
Okay.
excited about
All right. I'm going to stop
and get your
sharing
thoughts
mine.
on it. Okay, so
Okay.
I'm going to share. Let's see what I'm going to share. Yeah, this is what I'm going to share. Okay, so you see my spreadsheet here.
Mm-hmm.
So, earlier I was talking about, or in general, we were talking about like what's the best way to measure symptoms. And this is my latest attempt. I call this my long COVID 40
Mm-hmm.
symptom assessment.
Yeah.
And it, I took 40 of the most common symptoms, and like this is all done through an iterative process with people with long COVID. So I've done over 1,000 symptom surveys over the last 5 years, and on this latest version, I just have 45 responses. Like these are numbers I think from 39 respondents. But if you think of it as an archery target, like the big constellation of long COVID symptoms, some of them are relatively frequent or rare, like vomiting. Well, so that's certainly a long COVID symptom, but it doesn't happen every week, and only a small percentage of the people experience that. But whereas like the fatigue and the brain fog are nearly everyone experiences it. So I made this target with these different percentile rings, 10, 30, 50, 70, 90%. And then I kind of graphed out, just put the dots on here randomly according to their percentile ring. And so you can see like this survey hits the dots. Well, it turned out the percentage, the frequencies are even higher than I was anticipating in the first 38 respondents. So I color coded these. Look how many fall into the yellow category. So 90%, 80% frequency. And in the red, in the 70s or the 60s, I only have two that are in this. So these are what I consider on target symptoms. And 9 of these measure the frequency of certain things, but most of them measure the severity on this 0 to 4 scale, where 4 is severe. I mean, 3 is like serious.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the average severity of these, the average severity is like 2.5. So, I mean, that can be severity or frequency, but basically that means, and also I looked over the past week and I said, I think back on the past week, how severe were your symptoms at the worst? And so these scores are quite high. And when I took it myself, I was kind of taken aback that my score was so high. I think my score was 17, and I was thinking, wow, usually I just have a handful or less of mild symptoms.
Hmm.
And I know I'm at the mild end of the spectrum, and I got a score of 17. Well, it turns out the average score is 80, and people are responding positively to 32 of the 40 items on the survey. So this isn't a long survey. It's like this takes 4 or 5 minutes at most to complete,
Hmm.
but it's really on target for the frequency and the severity. And I've gotten really good feedback on it so far in the people that in my Facebook group that have taken it, and which kind of like is validation, like, hey, this is a good survey for long COVID. But I do get some comments, of course, saying, well, why didn't you include like burning in the skull or burning in the feet and hands or burning in the mouth? And then like, well, yeah, I have those on the longer version of my survey, but they're less frequent symptoms, so they didn't make this simple version where I just focus on the core symptoms.
Do you have a spot for like just other? So if
Well, yeah,
there's
yeah,
not
I
much
do
to look
have a
into for
comments field
other.
where they can enter in other symptoms because I want people to use it for tracking purposes on their, you know, to take it monthly or quarterly or before they visit the doctor or whatever, just to track their progress over time. But really, I've made this version of the series of the survey because I'm thinking like I want something that will be really good for next clinical trial that I get to run. It's something that's low burden, patient friendly, but also captures a lot of information. And it's a continuous measure. And I think this is similar to what we did in the diet and intermittent fasting trial, but I think it's
Hmm.
better.
Yeah, but will you be using this or something similar in your next trial as your main measure, or will it be a secondary measure?
I would use this as our primary measure. And then I would add in like fun cap and some of the other measures that other trials are using, like fatigue scale or the facet fatigue scale, and some other things like that as secondary measures. And there should be correlation between all the measures because there's a whole bunch of ways to measure this. And if someone's seeing you know, getting 50% better, they should get, almost any scale should pick that up, right? I mean, the pattern I saw for good responders in the in the trial that we did was that generally the symptoms would all decrease in severity kind of in parallel, and fatigue and PEM tended to have the highest average severity, but everything would decrease in severity. And then as people got better, some of their mild symptoms would go away completely. So I think it was like a snowman. Like we're capturing, you pile up all the symptoms and you got a snowman. And then if you have a good treatment, that snowman starts to melt
Yeah,
and things start to go away.
no, no. I think it's interesting. I think we need to have measures, and it's a strange thing because I personally find it difficult to do like daily symptom tracking. I've never been able to do that. Just it doesn't work for me. But at the same time, there was a person using the nicotine patch in the group, and she said that she was planning to come on the group and say that she's giving up on the nicotine patch because it's obviously not working. And she looked at her symptom tracking data, and over the past 2 weeks, it just had this very clear decline in symptoms over the past 2 weeks. But she didn't notice it until she looked at the graph, and the graph was just, very curly doing this. And she said, "Well, I guess it is working. I'll keep going."
Right. And yeah, yeah, I think it's really valuable. I mean, there's a lot of caveats. There's these flare ups that create a lot of noise and confuse whether you're getting better or not. So basically, you can measure the peaks, your symptoms at the worst, or the valleys, like how you feel in between the flare ups. And my initial attempts were kind of a snapshot trying to get in between the flare ups. And this latest one, I'm like, okay, you know, people are having flare ups all the time. We might as well expand it to a week and find out how bad their flare up was. So this kind of like turns up the volume on the signal.
Yeah.
And if someone's getting better, their flare ups should start to get milder and milder and then go away completely if they fully recover.
Yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned before when we were talking before, I think that it's a good system, especially if it's like only once a week. So then it's easier, it's less of a stress for patients to be tracking.
Yeah, and some of these clinical trials are only measuring initial symptoms and then at the end of treatment or maybe 90 days after the end of the treatment. And they're not doing these weekly surveys. And I'm like, wow, they're missing out on all this information.
The only weak point I see with that type of thing is it could be measuring how well somebody is pacing. So I think like if we could say to somebody, "Oh, well, you're getting these flares. Well, why did you get the flare? Oh, well, I did too much that day or whatever." And then you can say, "Okay, well, do these things to pace, and then we can get their numbers to go down just by
Yeah, and
pacing
that
better."
is definitely a challenge. Like in our fasting trial, I had one participant that was, I mean, men generally have a lower symptom burden than the females, and he didn't look like it was a particularly severe case. And then all of a sudden, he moved, across country and drove a long distance and totally overdid it. And then he took the symptom survey, at a particular day when he was supposed to take it, and his score went from like 12 to like 40 or 50. I mean, it was like a huge, huge spike. And I was like, oh my God, what happened? And then I texted him and he told me what happened. And I was like, that's noise. And if that happens to be like at a key endpoint, measurement endpoint in your trial, it's a
Mhm.
confounder. It totally messes it up. And so that's just an example of there's going to be some noise. There's going to be some people that don't pace properly.
Yeah.
And that's why we need 60, 100 people in a trial so that, that kind of gets washed out.
But I think in a trial design, you could also say like, well, if somebody gets sick or has a major life event, then, like pause the trial for them until they're kind of over that major life event and then continue after.
Yeah, yeah. Usually you don't get a pause during a trial. I've never seen that. You don't get to skip weeks. But
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing a drug trial and somebody gets shot, and they're not gonna say, "Oh, well, he got shot. Well, look at his symptoms. The drug didn't work." They would take that into account. And for
yeah, yeah.
somebody with
I mean,
long COVID,
they would get
getting the
unenrolled
flu
or
or something
something.
is like getting shot.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, you do have to think about what you do about reinfections, whether it's the flu or RSV or COVID. Do they get excluded from the trial because they had this confounding factor? There's a lot of in real life. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of real life doesn't stop for a clinical trial, and I saw it up close and personal. It was, yeah, it's a challenging thing. The real
Yeah.
life scenarios.
And also when people have been sick for a long time, their nervous system is already sensitized to this. So even if they kind of recover, they could end up getting some infection or some other life event in the future that kind of makes them go backwards more easily than
Yeah.
a different person.
I mean, one thing that happened during the diet and fasting trial that I wasn't anticipating was that we had Canadian wildfires were real bad one summer, and I could tell where the smoke was hitting it. Like it went down into Minneapolis, or if it went into New York City, the Northeast. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, we were tracking adverse events and flare ups, and all of a sudden we started getting a whole bunch of adverse events. And I would look and see where they lived. And sure enough, like there's no doubt in my mind that people with long COVID react very badly to wildfire smoke. So that's another thing that caused some noise during the trial.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of, with these types of diseases, are more likely to have noise, I guess, than maybe some other types of diseases, or maybe more sensitive to different things. All right. Well, I think that's a good start
I
for a
agree.
series on research. We can choose some other topic to talk about next time. So maybe people can put in the comments about what type of topics you want us to cover on our research and other research. So this time we did, focusing on measures, but we can focus on subgroups or something in the future.
Troy,
Yeah.
there's a whole universe of things to talk about, but one thing I think is really interesting is how best to use nicotine and
Mhm.
how people, with the different strategies people are using. different ways people are using nicotine to
Hmm.
try to get better. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I've done a couple videos or interviews where I've talked about the different things, the different ways people are using it as well. But we could do something on that too.
Okay, okay.
And
I
then
mean,
and
I'd
then
be happy to.
maybe you can talk about the different types of fasting and how it works because I'm a big like a proponent of the Wilhelm Bohemi type of fasting since that's what I used and I find it
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
easier.
the European severe calorie restriction. I mean, I like that too. I've never tried it. I should try it.
Yeah. It's only like 200 calories a day, but it seems to make the fasting just generally go better. Whereas in my case, I was using too strong antibiotics. So what helped me might not have been the fasting. It might have been the antibiotics or a combination of the antibiotics and the fasting. And for example, Remission Biome has a group of 50 people that they're testing antibiotics to see if they can recreate remission events that other people have had as well.
Right, right.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Yeah. Anyway, we there's a lot of things to talk about. But anyway, yeah, let's do this again, Troy.
Yeah. We'll set up another one soon. So remember, take care of yourself and take care of somebody else too if you can. Bye bye.